by saying I'm thrilled to be here, thrilled to be joined yet again. I know the audience are going to be happy. Every time we gather together around the table, the Apocryphal Apocalypse team, people, you all love it. Brothers and sisters, we're happy to be here with you. And we're going to be talking about the book of 2nd Maccabees. You've heard the famous purgatorial passages tons of times, but maybe you haven't heard this particular argument that our evangelical friends have brought to the table. And we thought it worthy enough to get together, to gather around the table and to talk about it. So we're thrilled to be here with you all. But before we even dive in, I'd like to go around the virtual table, if you will. Gary, brother, how have you been, my friend?
Doing well. Busy doing research.
Yeah.
Just got done some talks and stuff like that.
I heard that your talks were incredible at the Standing for Truth conference, I believe. I heard they were very, very good. Congratulations on that, Gary.
Oh, thanks. Appreciate it.
Definitely. David, brother, you who are always busy as well. I know you've been working on material that you hope to debut, God willing, soon. What else have you been up to, brother?
Yeah, I'm working on my studies and also, researching in means of the canon, apostolic succession, all sorts of things, but everything's going on slowly, of course. But always happy to be with you guys. Always very happy to reserve some time for roundtables like this. What about you, William?
I have been up to a lot as well, working on a lot of material, writing, debating, preparing for shows like this. And every time I get together with you, brothers, I am thrilled, really, really happy. We always have a lot of fun. And I had never heard of this particular argument brought out before, but I'm pleased to say that Turton and Dan Chapa, who brought it to the table, as people may know, they are part of the Alpha and Omega team, and they also run Calvinist Answers. I think that they are both respectful gentlemen, and I think that their argument is robust enough that it warrants a response. And I let Turton know that we plan to respond, and he was eager. He is going to be eager to see it. So when it debuts, he'll be eager to check it out and probably be watching right now as it is premiering. But one particular argument that they make, they are very well aware that the purgatorial passages, if you will, of 2nd Maccabees 12, 38 and beyond, depending on what Bible edition you have numbered there. I say 38 because really the context begins around there, maybe a little before. They will make the claim that the famous prayer for the dead passages are more or less interpolations. I had never heard that before, and I was fascinated by it. Went over their video, was very pleased that they provided scholarly argumentation, if you will. I don't think it holds up in the end. In fact, I'm confident it does not hold up. But either which way, it's an argument that I think our Apocryphal Apocalypse followers, friends that tune in will be pleased to learn, because, hey, what we've promised you all from the beginning, what Gary has put forth all the time, as Gary is tirelessly, as well as David, is cutting-edge material so that you can stay on your toes, if you will. You can be aware of everything going on in the world of apologetics, particularly on the canon. So I've always thought that it's fascinating whenever anything new like that comes up. Gary, had you ever heard that particular argument before?
I've seen stuff in critical literature that sort of sounds like that, but I think this is probably the first I've heard a Protestant apologist utilize that approach.
Right. Yeah. David, had you ever heard it before?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
So I was also pleased to hear something new.
Yeah. No doubt. Yeah. Yeah. Anytime we get to hear something new, to me it is pleasing. But either which way, we'll dive in. And I do, for the edification of the audience, I do want to go over 2nd Maccabees 12 again, so they can be aware of the context. They probably are already. We've read it. We've done shows on it, written books and mentioned it. Gary's incredible books on the topic. So let's dive in again, though. And begin. 2nd Maccabees 12. But a certain Dositheus, one of Basinor's men, who was on a horseback and was a strong man, caught hold of Gorgias and, grasping his cloak, was dragging him off by main strength, wishing to take the accursed man alive, when one of the Thracian cavalry bore down on him and cut off his arm. So Gorgias escaped and reached Marissa. As Esdras and his men had been fighting for a long time and were weary, Judas called upon the Lord to show himself their ally and leader in battle. In the language of their ancestors, he raised the battle cry with hymns. Then he charged against gorgeous troops when they were not expecting it and put them to flight. Then Judas assembled his army and went to the city of Adullam. As the seventh day was coming on, they purified themselves according to the custom and kept the Sabbath there. On the next day, as had now become necessary, Judas and his men went to take up the bodies of the fallen and to bring them to lie with their kindred in the tombs of their ancestors. Then under the tunic of each one of the dead, they found sacred tokens of the idols of Jamnia, which the law forbids the Jews to wear. And it became clear to all that this was the reason these men had fallen. So they all blessed the ways from the Lord, the righteous judge, who reveals the things that are hidden. And they turned to supplication, praying that the sin that had been committed might be wholly blotted out. The noble Judas exhorted the people to keep themselves free from sin, for they had seen with their own eyes what had happened as the result of the sin of those who had fallen. He also took up a collection, man by man, to the amount of 2,000 drachmas of silver, sent it to Jerusalem to provide for a purification offering. In doing this, he acted very well and honorably, taking into account the resurrection. For if he were not expecting that those who had fallen would rise again, it would have been superfluous and foolish to pray for the dead. Now, you brothers are very well aware of these very famous purgatorial passages, as I like to call them. They're very, very famous. They're utilized not only by Catholics, they're utilized by our Orthodox friends. They are utilized by many individuals, even certain evangelicals that hold and believe to purgatory. And as you know very well, the book of the Second Maccabees has been canonical in the ancient apostolic church from the very beginning. So these are very prominent passages. So I think that our evangelical friends on the other side were really careful in going after this book. And I think the point of them doing that was because they realized how robust this text is for proving the doctrine of purgatory, utilized through history. The great Augustine utilized it. And it was a battleground text, if you will, during the time of the Reformation era debates. Gary, what are your particular thoughts on 2 Maccabees 12? Any thoughts at all?
Well, yeah, there's not much I can add to that. It showed up in the Leipzig Disputation, which, of course, is where Luther denies Maccabees as part of the canon. And it's not the only proof text for purgatory. That's important, but it does show that this idea was present before the time of Christ. And I mean, I don't have anything more to add. David, do you have anything?
I think not. I pretty much agree with everything what was said here.
Yeah. I mean, it really pretty much is straightforward. And I think the important thing when we look at 2 Maccabees is we have evidence, early evidence indeed, of a prayer for the dead in Judaism. And I think that our evangelical friends very often think that 2 Maccabees, okay, that is a text that the Jews today do not hold to be canonical. Thus, this is a later invention, this idea of praying for the dead. The fact of the matter is, in Judaism, from the very earliest of times, there has been that tradition of praying for the dead, sacred tradition, if you will. You got it in 2 Maccabees, and you have it throughout Jewish history as well. So we'll look at that in a moment. But in particular, this is not a novel thing. This is not something that in Catholicism was invented, if you will. And you hear it very often that, this is something that occurred later in history. And it very clearly didn't. And remember, I think the important thing to emphasize in 2 Maccabees is there's a reason why they're praying for the dead, a clear reason. If he was looking to the splendid reward that is laid up for those who fall asleep in godliness, it was a holy and pious thought. Therefore, he made atonement for the dead so that they might be delivered from their sin. And one thing that I've always brought up, I know Gary has brought it up too before, is look, this is very clearly purgatorial because people are not going to be delivered from throwing a party, having a party. They got to be delivered from a kind of suffering, a kind of punishment, if you will. Any particular thoughts on that, Gary?
Yeah, in fact, I believe, Luther believed that's what Maccabees taught, right?
Yep.
I'm pretty sure Calvin did and the others as well.
Yeah.
You don't really find them disputing the meaning of or the interpretation of Second Maccabees. Rather, they went to disputing the canonicity. And quite frankly, if they believed it didn't teach purgatory, I'm not sure why they would contest the canonicity. That was really the reason why the whole issue of canonicity came up, was because they saw that it taught purgatory.
Any particular thoughts on that, David?
Yeah, so in this last video from 13 Fan, right? So he said, but just plainly, there's no mention of purgatory in the text, right? No one says there's some, fire and souls tormented or something like that. So, we Catholics, we just read these things, but to me, it sounds similar when Unitarian tries to approach, with these words like, Jesus never says I'm God,
Yeah.
I mean, what are you guys talking about? I mean, it's not there explicitly at all. But then we have to ask the question: what was the whole purpose of this text? I mean, clearly these people are delivered from their sin, right?
Yeah.
That's the point. If they cannot be delivered from their sin, of course, then there's no meaning for pray for them because they're in the right place. I mean, yeah, as you said, you don't want to get delivered from a good place, right? Or
no doubt.
Faith, or whatever I mean, purgatory is not defined in any way. We don't know how it looks like or what it is exactly. But clearly, sin means suffering. You cannot, detach suffering from sin that follows. And, if you put all these together, then clearly that's purgatory.
Yeah.
Someone is praying for you, so you still can be delivered from these attachments or sins or these punishments that are the consequence of sin. That's purgatory. The essence is there.
I completely, without a doubt, agree. And you brought up a number of very good points there. I've heard Turretin and others, you've even heard James White say that, there's no evidence there of purgatory, and what is being spoken of in the early writers and the early fathers rather is a refrigerium, if you will, a refreshment. And they get that from the language utilized in Latin by Tertullian. But what is Tertullian talking about? What do you need a refreshment from? What do you need a reprieve of? And it's very similar to the language utilized in Perpetuum Felicitas, where at the very end, you clearly have the necessity of the, I'm trying to remember, the departed brother, Dinocrates. He is delivered from the place of darkness after her prayers. He's delivered from that suffering and the darkness after her endless prayers. And now he is receiving refreshment. He is at a fountain with overflowing water. But that refreshment means he's no longer suffering. So it goes hand in hand with the idea of suffering. And it very much is purgatorial. And Gary brought up a great point. The reformers knew that this was purgatorial. Indeed, I'd even rewind. I'd go earlier. Proto-reformers, if you will. Jan Hus believes this to be purgatorial. In fact, a great argument can be made from the very best Hus scholars that I have found, and David would probably be able to hunt these down better than myself. But I've read that even the very best Jan Hus scholars argue that whereas Hus had many issues with the church, he never denied purgatory. He had great issues with indulgences, what have you, but never denied the belief in purgatory and pointed out that this is a purgatorial text. Wycliffe did as well. Luther did as well. Calvin did. So clearly, if today, modern day Protestants are denying that it is purgatorial, where your forefathers knew it was purgatorial, thus they strongly rejected it. And I think that is the historical record is very clear. It's been utilized in this way throughout history, and we should utilize it that way. What are your thoughts on that, Deep?
Oh yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree. I honestly, I don't know about anybody denying Second Maccabees teaching Purgatory.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah. Were you going to say something, Gary?
Oh, no. It's curious that, it was an issue back in the Reformation, and then now apparently the text doesn't teach that. It's
right.
Amazing how things work out that way. Once the text is disposed of and the Bible sanitized, and
That's a great point there. Yeah, you're right. It's already been disposed of, and I guess the argument would be like, well, you know what? It doesn't matter. Even if the book were there, even if we would have granted the book were canonical, it still doesn't teach purgatory. Just these arguments really don't work. But there is a commentary, the NETS commentary, the NETS, if you will, that they bring up. And they quote from it, and they'll bring it up multiple times. And in the NETS commentary, it says, the main body of the text goes back to Jason of Cyrene, the author of whose 5-volume history was abbreviated or epitomized. However, Jason could not possibly have produced some passages, 4:17, 5:17 to 20, 6:12 to 17. The epitomator authored them. The whole of chapter 7 and 12:43 to 45 and 14:37 to 46 also seem alien in the context of Jason's history. Now, here's the one thing before we even dive into this, brothers, that just really, really got me. You've got these Protestants saying, oh, it's an interpolation. Interpolation, it doesn't even belong there originally. But not even the NETS is as bold as to make that claim. Rather, the NETS says it seems alien to the context of Jason's history, and it includes the purgatorial passages. And of course, it refers you back to a German work that we're going to look at a very tiny portion of in a moment. But to me, that's a giant jump of it seems alien to the context, and then it's an interpolation. That to me is a giant jump. What are your particular thoughts on that, Gary?
Yeah, I thought this was kind of a sleight of hand on their part, because what they're doing, and the audience might not have noticed, is they're switching from like form criticism to textual criticism, as if they're both the same thing, right? And form criticism deals with pre-canonical sources and how they're used, and that's what the NET is speaking about. Second Maccabees relies on this work of Jason, and then they're just commenting, and it seems as if, notice it's just their opinion, that these particular passages probably wouldn't fit in Jason's work, which, by the way, doesn't exist anymore. So there's no way to know for certain what exactly was there and what wasn't. So they're saying that this seems to be the final editor's comments, right? That's form criticism. That's fine. But that's not what they later claim, because later on they claim, like you said, that it's possibly a Christian interpolation or something that was added later, and that actually deals more with textual criticism. Like, what manuscript evidence do you have that after the final canonical text was done, that this interpolation was added to that and changes the meaning of the text? And they're really apples and oranges, aren't they, William?
They are, without a doubt. And Gary, I'm glad that you brought that up and put that at the forefront, because you're right. They are, and I don't want to make the claim that they're being dishonest, but I thought it was a sleight of hand. And I thought it was a sleight of hand that can maybe mislead people. And very clearly, not even the NETS is going as far as they're going. And the German journal, will by the way, I read about 9 to 10 pages of the German journal. There was not much worth even translating, because there's really a lot of it is just speculation. And when there's speculation, that speculation tends to go a little bit on and on about other passages. The area where it deals, and David, who I think David said, you said your German is limited. It doesn't matter if your German is limited. You got the gist of it. There's really not much there. And when it does mention Second Maccabees, it's just pretty much the opinion of the author, and there's really not much there. But we'll look at that in a moment. Before we get there, David, any particular thoughts on this here?
Yeah, so they raised this issue. I mean, in the beginning, these apologists says, this is just a red flag, just a, secondary point. But actually, if you look at the video, they bring it up over and over again. And they're approaching the text in this way that these sections are not original to the text. So I think it is a very important part of their argument. But, I wonder if they actually looked up the primary source that the Netz is referring to, the German text, right?
I doubt it.
Because if you look at it, there's not much. As you said, we're going to look into that as well. But, several thoughts. If you really want to be consistent, I'm curious if they do have the same approach to other books as well. For instance, in my series to the book of Esdras, I brought up that the book of Ezra was originally just much shorter, which is called the Memoirs of Ezra. And in that instance, Ezra is speaking in the first person. Right? Moreover, it's written in a different language. So the original Ezra is a combine of Aramaic and Hebrew. Okay, so it could not be written by the same author. Moreover, some parts are written in the first person, some parts are written in the third person. Scholarship unanimously agrees that the book of Ezra developed over time. Same way Nehemiah. Josephus knew about a much shorter book of Nehemiah. So if you want to be consistent and take this argument, I hope they would also consider the same approach for biblical books, which they consider inspired, but then they have a problem because, of course, now they would argue that, prophecy ceased, the divine voice ceased in 400 BC or something like that. So everything that was written afterwards, that's not inspired and so on and so forth. The argument, right? But if these books really developed, then, of course, either many parts of these books are not inspired or you cannot argue for the cessation of prophecy, of course. You cannot also argue for the authorship, right? Now, we Catholics are not bound by who wrote the book or how it was edited or something like that. My purpose is just to confirm that it is inspired, right? But if they want to go that, everything was written in 400 BC and so on, so they're absolutely out of scholarship. They are out of the realm of scholarship. So I would like to see them to be consistent in this way. And that's not only about Ezra, that's about Daniel, that's about Isaiah, it's about Jeremiah. There are a shorter and a longer version of Jeremiah in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So, there are too many things that are problematic if you apply the same arguments to their Bible. And the second thing is, if you look at this commentary from Netz, it says the whole chapter 7. Now, in the chapter 7, we have the Maccabean martyrs. And Paul actually refers to these martyrs in his epistle to the Hebrews, right? So, Gary, you made an incredible video on all those commentaries that acknowledge that Hebrews 11 refers to the Maccabean martyrs. So for Paul, these sections were already in 2nd Maccabees. Okay, so, and the third problem is that, we don't have actually Jason's work. So what do you want to compare? No, you cannot simply just argue that it is alien to Jason of Cyrene. As you said, that's really a stretch. If you don't have hard evidence, you cannot really make this argument.
Yeah, and whenever you're interpreting a text, you interpret it in light of its final form, right? Because there's plenty of texts in scriptures that use pre-canonical material, like the Gospel of Luke, right? Now, higher criticism, they will go into that. They'll try to distinguish the sources and then try to interpret what the original source's intent was and what the editing, the final editor's intent was. But that's, that's almost, that's something that I think most conservative Protestants would kind of look down their nose on, right? Because it's all guesswork. If you want to really understand what the Gospel of Luke says, you interpret Luke's comments and editing of those pre-canonical sources and assume that, well, that's the intent that Luke is presenting for the Gospel of Luke, right? So that's the proper interpretation of Luke. You don't, but what these people are doing is they're looking at the pre-canonical sources And they're not only saying that, they're saying that the final editor either didn't understand the original source or actually contradicts the original source. And so they're pitting the final editor against the pre-canonical sources that the final editor is using,
Yeah.
Which you're allowed to do that. I mean, anybody could do whatever they want, but that's not what you would consider, or I would consider, an authentic interpretation of the text. If you want to know what the text is saying, you have to take the whole thing. And I don't know, William, any thoughts on that?
No, I think you both hammered it down perfectly. Yeah, you've got to take the whole of it. And I think that another particular argument that they've made before, I don't remember if they made it in this video, they tried to make it seem as if the idea of what is going on here would have been completely alien to the mindset of the early Jewish people. It clearly wasn't. It clearly wasn't. Prayer for the dead, something you're going to find goes on throughout Jewish history. So I didn't think that was very good. I thought that they were incorrect on that particular point. And the other thing, again, just to really emphasize, I think that and I understand, look, they're doing apologetics, but I think that at times when we're doing apologetic material, we've got to be very careful with the statements we make, because it's fine and dandy to make statements on your own apologetic material, but when you're relying on commentaries that are in the scholarly realm, and you're trying to prop it up as if the scholarly material supports what you're saying, that's a whole other issue, because they made it seem as if the scholarly stuff supported their particular argument. And as David can affirm, I forgot, I lost count with the amount of times that they repeat this. And they went, in my opinion, too far at trying to make the argument that it was an interpolation. And I don't think look, as far as I recall, I don't think they even one time mentioned going to the critical text itself. Not even once. And if you do go to the critical text, we'll look at in a moment. By the way, they do know what critical text is, because I've debated Turretin many times. He knows what it is. But if they put the critical text on the screen, that's going to do a lot of damage to their case, because it just doesn't match up with the apologetic argument that they're making, that this is an interpolation. Okay, well, where is it missing? From one ancient manuscript. You're going to have to, now, of course, that's not what the NETS is claiming. And that's not what the German work that it references is claiming either. They're not saying it's an interpolation. So it's problematic in my opinion. David, were you going to say something?
Yeah, and I wanted to follow up on what Gary said. Jason of Cyrene lived roughly in the same period as these events happened. And also the second book, Maccabees, is estimated to be written in the same period as it happened. So saying that, these narrators absolutely misrepresented Judas Maccabees, because if you look at the video, they say, one thing is what the narrator says, but the other thing, what really happened. So they try to say that, the narrator is probably wrong or something like that. He misunderstood Judas Maccabees, his intentions and all this stuff. I mean, come on, man. Everybody would notice that. Yeah. They lived in the same period,
Right.
Yep, no doubt.
Yeah. And am I correct, William? Because I wasn't really sure what they were claiming. Are they claiming that that portions of this is the work of the final editor, or are they claiming that these portions were not part of the final edit, but were added to the textual tradition early on?
I think that from what I gathered, I think that they're arguing that it was from the final editor. So either which way, they're trying to argue that it's alien to the text. That's what I gathered, right, David?
Yeah. And that basically it's probably not, what Jason of Cyrene also wrote
right.
in his 5-volume book of the history.
Yeah.
But it very well could, in my opinion, sound misleading to audiences, because by calling something an interpolation, people are then going to think, okay, well, then does it not belong to the text? Are there any, when you look at the critical edition, are there any notes that, well, maybe this doesn't belong here? Look, either which way, whatever position you want to take, the final edition of Second Maccabees has always included this, always. And there's no evidence otherwise. There's none.
Right.
And by looking at the critical text, we can show that. You can make every claim you want to make. And at the end of the day, clearly, these arguments of interpolation are stretching things, because even the NETS says that 1243 to 45 seems alien to the context of Jason's history. And it will then reference this particular book here. And people may be wondering, well, you get a summary of the arguments on pages 171 to 173. By the way, there are multiple editions, but no edition really has any significant changes. This here is pretty much really the gist of what is said. There's a lot said about other passages, and then I was very underwhelmed. I was disappointed because I was hoping there'd be more meat to the matter. I was hoping that maybe the German author would get into 2 Maccabees 12 and say, okay, well, this is the reason why we believe, or this is the reason why I strongly believe that this is, alien to the original context or not from the original author or what have you. But really all that is said is, it's possibly post-Jasonian or furthermore later written. And then that's it. Before we get to that in German, he will tell you that it is possibly written later. And then he goes on long statements on other issues, historical matters, and then multiple pages pass. And then in the final one, page 173, I believe, that's it. I believe it's towards the middle or towards the end of the page. That's just it. In reference to 2 Maccabees 12:43 to 45 and others as well, he says possibly post-Jasonian or furthermore later written. And, somebody like myself, I'm a major geek when it comes to this stuff. I want to really, dig in, and I want to see, okay, well, where is the meat of the matter? Where, and unfortunately, really, there's really not a whole lot there. Any particular thoughts, brothers? Because there's really, I really don't know what else to say about that.
Yeah, if I'm correct, before the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, people thought that Enoch was written after the New Testament or something like that, and then big surprise, now we got Enoch in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So,
yeah, no doubt. And just to add, before I'll go to you right now, Gary, but I did do the research and I did dig in to try and see if there were other scholars. I was able to find maybe one other one. The problem is this: there is no conclusive manuscript support at all. To claim that 2 Maccabees 12:43 to 45 is a later interpolation, it lacks any solid manuscript evidence. The very key manuscript of 2 Maccabees, those that we utilize for the Septuagint, they don't show any kind of variation like this at all. And ultimately, what this German author is suggesting, he is suggesting that 2 Maccabees 12:43 to 45 is a later interpolation. But this is a very, very minor scholarly hypothesis with zero textual evidence. Furthermore, his argument is, by the way, this is the gist of what he does. The majority of his argument, actually the beating heart of it, is massively based on thematic or stylistic grounds, rather than on any really concrete manuscript evidence or any kind of evidence. So even he will admit to you that it's an opinion based upon that. That is why he says it's his opinion based upon what he believes to be thematic and stylistic grounds. And even he is honest about it being an opinion. So I believe that our evangelical friends have tried to make this a powerful, robust, apologetic argument, and there really is nothing there. Gary, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, see, that's the problem, is this is just pure speculation, and it really can't be proved decisively one way or another. So what it seems like is this is just speculating built upon other speculation, which is built upon theory, which is built upon opinion, right? It's like you can't refute it because there's really nothing to refute. It's just this might be, this appears to be, it's possible, it's likely.
Yeah,
it might be.
There's no evidence.
Yeah, right.
And David, correct me if I'm wrong, but you would expect for a robust argument to have words that were more powerful than possibly. Possibly. It's clearly his opinion. And by the way, let me be clear for the audience. The NETS, when it does make this commentary in it, it will have a footnote number 2, I believe. And if you go down there, footnote number 2 will lead you to that work right there. And I have summarized what the work tells you in German. If people think I'm wrong, find a German reader, and they will confirm to you. There's not a whole lot there in pages 171 and 173. He's basing it on thematic and stylistic concepts that he believes, okay, it's possibly, but he never once says, I am certainly convinced. And oh, look, here's another thing that you don't have there. Anybody that is aware of how scholarly works do work and operate, scholarly journals, anytime you make a strong argument, you're going to have a footnote and you're going to have a bunch of scholars backing you up. Anytime you do that, I'll tell you right now, you're doing work in Christology and Mariology and you make a statement of something that is definitely goes against the grain of academia, well, you're going to bring up multiple scholars that back you up. He does not do that. And in the world of the scholarly world, I looked for others and I couldn't find any others. I reached out to prominent Baptist scholar and canonical scholar, Dr. Lee Martin McDonald, because I didn't think this is a robust argument. And Dr. McDonald confirmed to us that no, this is not a widespread argument. And this is not an argument that really, in essence, would be taken seriously. And with that being said, fortunately, I think this video will edify many. But unfortunately, I don't think this apologetic is one that has any legs. Gary, any thoughts on that?
No, I think you said it all.
David, anything to add?
Yeah, completely agree.
Great. Well, the one thing that I did think was valuable to do, and I think Turton Fan and Dan should have done, but I think that the part probably didn't want to do it, because they know that the critical text does nothing to support their case. And I went over the critical text. I reached out to the Reverend Dr. Kappas, who is a top Greek scholar. He didn't take the argument seriously. And what we're going to look at right now is the text from the Göttingen Septuagint, which anybody that knows their Greek Old Testaments knows that this Septuagint is pretty much dubbed the BMW or the Rolls-Royce of Septuagints. It's critical text. It is elite of the elite. And it represents the largest Septuagint project ever undertaken. Published between 1931 and 2006, the 24-volume Göttingen Septuagint contains the most authoritative critical apparatus of the Greek Old Testament ever assembled, combining textual evidence from countless manuscripts and ancient sources, including Philo, Josephus, and the Greek church fathers. The Göttingen Septuagint is the most detailed and elaborate critical edition of the Septuagint ever published. You'd figure that maybe there'd be something there, maybe a footnote when we get to 12, Second Maccabees 12, 43 to 45, maybe something there, but there's nothing. There's just nothing. And I began earlier than 43 to 45. I bolded the 43 to 45, but I began right there in 40. There's nothing there. There's nothing there for their argument. Rather, we have got the text present right there in the Greek. No footnote warning you this may be an interpolation. This may not be part of the original. This may not be part of the original mindset of the author. Nothing there. And indeed, I'm going to argue it is very clearly by the context. That's why I began in verse 38. Everything leads you to believe it does belong there. The men have fallen in war. They go and they pick up their bodies, and then they pray for the fallen. It is nothing like, okay, I'm reading a chain of text, and bam, this is so disconnected from the chain of events that happened before. No, I'm reading it, and all of it does feel connected. I'd love to get your thoughts on that, Gary.
Yeah, and I checked some critical apparatus as well, and all you find is just minor variants, just like any other text. And anybody could pick up their Bible, and had this been, if there were manuscripts where this is entirely absent, you would find this section bracketed. So you could, for example, if you look at the woman caught in adultery, the New Testament, or where the angel stirs the water, you'll find those are bracketed, and you'll usually have a footnote saying that these sections are not found in all manuscripts, but they're included because there is evidence that it is genuine. You don't see anything like that, and you don't find anything in the variants. And like you said, this is really the best of the critical text that we have available for the Septuagint. And as you can see from William's reproduction, there's nothing that suggests that this is not part of the original text.
Nothing at all. David, any particular thoughts, brother?
And maybe just for those who don't know what does it mean, critical text, it means that it's based upon the oldest and best witnesses, manuscript witnesses of the book, right? And this means if there's no footnote, absolutely no caveat that there's a missing verse or something there, it means none of those manuscripts that the authors worked with have this lack of text in these oldest and best manuscripts, which means that ultimately you have no evidence. You don't have any proof. You don't have Jason's work. And so you don't have anything to compare with. I mean, it's all really just an assumption, which is primarily based, if you look at also Habich's, I think, page 187, he argues that probably in the 2nd century, resurrection was not believed in Judaism, which again goes to some speculations that also Daniel actually wasn't written by Daniel, but in the 2nd century. So again, problems for anybody who wants to use this argumentation. Yeah, that's all.
Big time problems with using that argumentation. David, a lot of it relies on speculation.
Exactly.
If not all of it. Not all of it.
Yeah. I mean, it can change anytime, sooner or later, in scholarship.
Yeah, no doubt.
Speculation is fine. It's just got to be well-grounded speculation.
Right.
Sure.
And the problem is, I don't see the evidence.
No. And to be very clear, Gary, you've written a number of fantastic books in the canon. You've done a lot of research on the deuterocanonical books. I've done a fair amount of research. So has David. The fact that this argument was relatively new to our ears at this level tells you that, well, it's not widespread at all. And if it is not widespread, just as the German author said, it's pretty much his opinion. And I want to be clear. I am not beating the German author over the head at all, or the NETS. They're not presenting this as a kind of end-all dogmatic position, or a kind of an authoritative position, if you will. They are clear that it's an opinion, and they're clear possibly. Well, possibly is not very certain, is it? Yet our evangelical friends are very positive in their apologetic effort, to the point where they are giddy at repeating it multiple times in the video. Now, another thing that I like to mention is I think Turretin and Dan Chapa are two individuals that are reputable, have a solid reputation. And in the past, I have noticed when they've been corrected, they have retracted arguments. For instance, I corrected them before on that argument of German Bibles before Luther lacking having alone in Romans 3:28, and I've corrected them on that, and they've retracted that particular argument. So I think that they are reputable gentlemen, and I think that this is an argument that, unfortunately, I don't think it has any solid backing at all. And with that being said, I don't think that there's any reason to believe that this is novel to Judaism. Number one, you've got it there in 2 Maccabees, clearly there, and you even know when you look through history, the earliest version of the Kaddish dates back to the time many scholars date to the Second Temple. The Kaddish, at that period, was called the Half Kaddish. Now, if you look and you dig in, the Jewish Virtual Library notes that the mourner's Kaddish is recited for 11 months from the day of the death of an individual, and also on the anniversary of a death. A person may say Kaddish not only for parents, but also for a child, a brother, or an in-law. An adopted son should say it for adoptive parents who raised him. So the Jewish sacred tradition of praying for the dead is strongly connected to the belief that it frees the souls of the deceased. This is reflected in the Midrash Tana Devi Eliyahu. And in here you read, let me go ahead and dig in, and I'd love to get you brothers' thoughts. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said, excuse me, one time I was going along the way, and I came across a man who was gathering wood. I spoke to him, but he did not respond. Afterwards, the man came to me and said, Rabbi, I am dead, not alive. I asked him, if you are dead, what do you need this wood for? He replied, Rabbi, listen to what I am about to tell you. While I was alive, my companion and I used to engage in sin in my mansion. When we came to this world, we were sentenced to burning. While I gather wood, they burn my friend, and while he gathers wood, they burn me. I inquired, how long is this sentence to last? The dead man answered, when I came to this world, I left behind a pregnant wife. I know she's expecting a boy. I beg of you, keep an eye on him from the moment he is born until he is 5 years old. Then bring him to school. For the moment he responds, bless Hashem, was blessed, I will be released from judgment in Gehinnom. Now, this text is speaking of one suffering temporal punishment in the afterlife. Interestingly enough, you've got the imagery of fire present there as well, as many of the fathers spoke of a purifying fire, and as that very clear metaphor is utilized in 1 Corinthians 3 as well, and other passages. But that's fascinating. The text is speaking of one suffering temporal punishment in the afterlife. The one that is suffering is eventually liberated by prayers. And this text has been traditionally ascribed to Rabbi from the first century. Now, I know that I think our best editions are, I believe, early 3rd century, but it has been dated to quite early. Either which way you look at it, as we've looked at multiple references, the idea of praying for the dead, this idea of one that is passed on to the afterlife, undergoing a suffering to where prayer will loose them from the suffering of the sins, it's been prevalent throughout Jewish history. And, you know, all you have to do is just look up, go to the Jewish Virtual Encyclopedia, go to various references. This is not a novelty. Any particular thoughts, Gary?
Yeah, Rabbi Ben Zakkai, I believe he's the one who negotiated with the Romans before the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 to allow them to set up the school in Yabne or Yabne. And so that would be the second half of the 1st century that this goes back. Now, whether it's historical or not, you know, you always have to take a grain of salt. But what it does show is that the early rabbis believed that this belief came from as early as the 1st century, right?
Correct.
So, this very interesting text. I've never seen that before.
Oh, I thought you had. Okay. Yeah, and looking at the Mourner's Kaddish, and then, and I'll get your thoughts right now, David, and then looking at the Jewish Encyclopedia, which I'll read in a moment. I know the argument that our evangelical friends will respond, because I debated Dr. Brown. And Dr. Brown, of course, as well, all evangelicals will say, okay, well, the Jewish Encyclopedia, but that's modern day Judaism. You all can't prove that from the ancient of times they've prayed for the dead and believed in this, but we can. We can do that by tracing it through the historical record, early in the Old Testament, and then early on in the Christian era during the Judaic period. At the time, they believed in it throughout that era as well, even to this day. So I think that is valuable. The Jewish Encyclopedia is valuable because you can trace a particular unbroken kind of lineage throughout history. David, your thoughts, brother?
Yeah, that's a great source. I also haven't heard about it. So kudos to you, William. Thank you. And yeah, I looked at the Jewish Encyclopedia. There are further sources, like, for example, one of the versions of the Testament of Abraham, which is clearly Jewish. It's not Christian at all. And there's also this passage where a soul is delivered from the torment after praying for it. And also the Sefer of Numbers on the book of, or Deuteronomy, sorry, maybe Sefer on Deuteronomy. And these are second century sources, so they were actually written in the second century, which is rabbinic tradition, right? So,
Yep.
I think multiple Jewish sources attest to the fact that these Jewish people believed in some kind of intermediate state or place or whatever you want to call it. You don't necessarily have to call it purgatory if you don't like the word.
Right.
But clearly, and it certainly wasn't something heretical, because I think it would not make it into the Midrash or to the Sifra in the first place,
Yeah.
Or they would condemn it right afterwards when they cite it. So I think it was absolutely accepted in the Jewish circles, if not mainstream, I would argue.
No, that's a great point. And I think that one thing that I avoided to bring it up is, if you look in the medieval era, some incredibly prominent rabbis will promote this particular belief. But I avoided that because, of course, very easily our Protestant friends can say, okay, we add medieval very late. But as you brought up, earlier source material can show this was believed early on. And let's dive into the Jewish Encyclopedia. The view of purgatory is still more clearly expressed in rabbinical passages, as in the teaching of the Shemites. In the last judgment day, there shall be 3 classes of souls. The righteous shall at once be written down for life everlasting, the wicked for Gehenna. But those whose virtues and sins counterbalance one another should go down to Gehenna and float up and down until they rise purified. For of them it is said, I will bring the third part into the fire and refine them as silver is refined, and try them as gold is tried. Also, he, the Lord, bringeth down to Sheol and bringeth up again. The Hillelites seem to have had no purgatory, for they said, he who is plenteous in mercy inclines the balance towards mercy. Consequently, the intermediates do not descend into Gehenna. Still, they also speak of an intermediate state. That is the Jewish Encyclopedia, which is fascinating. And we can trace throughout history that this belief is prevalent. It's prevalent in the Old Testament. It was prevalent in the Old Testament of the Christians. It's a point that I like to emphasize. Look, I don't care where you look. Council of Rome 382, which I do think it was a council, or if you want to stick with Hippo and Carthage 393, 397, or any of the councils afterwards. Anytime the church gathered to discuss the contents of Holy Writ, sacred scripture, Second Maccabees is always part of the list of the Old Testament. You're never going to encounter a list of the Old Testament where the church gathers in council and Second Maccabees is left out. You're just not going to encounter it. It definitely was part of the Bible of the early church, and it should be part of the Bible of every follower of Christ. That is my strong opinion. Any thoughts on that, Gary?
Yeah, not only that, but the Maccabees is also used by church councils in their deliberations as well. So,
yes.
It's clearly used as a canonical text in addition to those lists.
Yep. And that's big, because ecumenical councils that utilize these books would have utilized books that they viewed as having strong authority. David, you were going to say something, brother?
Oh, yeah. The text you just read reminds me also Paul's letter to the Corinthians, because there's where he's also talking about gold and silver, the same way as you see here, So Protestants try to argue, Paul is not talking about purgatory there, but I see a clear connection, at least when you see the similarities of gold and silver are tested, and then all the other things are tested, right? And there's also a pre-Christian text, actually, in the book of Enoch, where this fiery lake, and everybody goes through it, but only some suffer, and others who are basically without justified, or how should I say, they don't feel the pain, but actually they feel it as a warm milk or something like that. Yeah. So even in Enoch, you have a glimpse of something that can torture or not, depending on the state you are in.
David, that's a brilliant point, because not only do you have that there, but that particular language is utilized by St. John Chrysostom, because John Chrysostom will note, and he'll say, look, at the end, we're all going to be tried in some way. Those that are justified, those that are fully justified, will go through this fire, as if having armor on, and the armor will not harm, the fire will not harm them, but rather they will come out even shinier, even purer than before. And it really does echo that particular kind of language. So this has been present. This kind of language has been present, from the very beginning. I thought that was great the way you laid that out. Another thing that I was fascinated by, and I think this would be a very fun way of closing out our examination and prayer for the dead and Purgatory, 2nd Maccabees, is you get to a certain time in history in the 4th century where you encounter an early heretic by the name of Arius of Pontus. Do not confuse Arius of Pontus with the famous Arius, the founder of the Arian movement. He was an Arian, though. He was, but he's not that Arius that you may be thinking of. And maybe a lot of people have not heard of Arius of Pontus, but he was an influential figure in the early church, and he stands out as the earliest recorded proponent of the rejection of prayer for the dead. I went through the earliest lists, and he seems to be the most prominent one to stick out. He was an adherent of Arianism, and it was a theological belief, in case some people don't know, that denied the full divinity of Christ. He gained notoriety for his unorthodox views. In the 4th century, Arius challenged the prevailing tradition of praying for the dead. His opposition to intercessory prayers for the departed marked him as a notorious heretic. That was part of the reasons why he was also condemned in the eyes of the mainstream Christian community. Indeed, you have the great saint of the faith, Saint Epiphanius, or Saint Epiphanius, however you want to pronounce it, preserving his words. Arius noted, "Why do you mention the names of the dead in prayer after their deaths? If the living prays or has given alms, how will this benefit the dead? If the prayer of the people here has benefited the people there, no one should practice piety or perform good works. He should get some friends any way he wants, either by bribery or asking friends on his deathbed. And they should pray that he may not suffer in the next life or be held accountable of his heinous sins." He preserves this in his Panarion. And we go forward. "But I shall take up the thread of this topic, i.e., praying for the dead." And this is, by the way, this is the response of the great Saint Epiphanius. So let's remember, Arius is condemning this idea. So they're butting heads on a number of issues. Epiphanius was famous for condemning multiple heresies in his medicine chest or his Panarion, whichever title you want to use. His Panarion, he goes over condemning multiple heresies, those that committed the heresy of idolatry, and those, of course, that were in heresy of Arianism. And this particular heresy, he rebuts it by noting, "But I shall take up the thread of this topic, praying for the dead, once more. The church is bound to keep this custom because she has received a tradition from the fathers. And who can violate a mother's precept or a father's law? As the words of Solomon tell us, 'Hear, my son, the words of thy father, and reject not the precepts of thy mother,' showing that the Father, God, that is, and the only begotten and the Holy Spirit taught both in writing and in unwritten form. But our mother, the church, had precepts which she kept inviolate and which cannot be broken. Now, since these precepts have been ordained in the church and are suitable, and all of them marvelous, this fraud of Arius in rejecting prayers for the dead is confounded in his turn." This, to me, is probably one of the most magnificent ones. He says, "But who has better knowledge of these things? The deluded man who has just arrived and is still alive today, i.e. Arius, or those who were witnesses before us, who've had the tradition of the church before us and received it in this form from their fathers, and their fathers in turn, who learned it from those before them, just as the church possesses the true faith and the traditions to this day because she has received them from her fathers." I thought that was a brilliant response. That, look, in other words, Arius, hey, man, we got this from the tradition of the church. The church teaches either in written and unwritten form. And this has been handed down by the church. And look, who has better knowledge? The deluded man who has just arrived, noting this is a novelty, or what the church has preserved from the beginning? Gary, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, that's a really, really good passage from Epiphanius. And when did Epiphanius live?
This was in the 300s. This was likely written probably around, I believe, the middle of the 300s. I believe, if I'm correct, or the latter end of the 300s. Either which way, you've got an early writing in the 4th century. So rather late in the historical record for one to begin condemning the idea of praying for the dead. And interestingly enough, it comes from an Arian. It's not like you have Saint Epiphanius, butting heads with a saint of the church. I think that is pretty significant. Any thoughts on that, Dave?
Yeah. Tremendous words here from Epiphanius. Very good. And of course, we could add to that also Augustine. Augustine was brought up by the two gentlemen, evangelical apologists, which when I looked at it, again, I see purgatory all over the place and praying for the dead. And same thing, same old thing.
Yeah, no doubt. It really is pretty much the same old thing. And there's one part of it that, let me put here, because I think this would be of value to the audience. Let me try and find it. This would be, okay. There's one thing that he says that I think really maybe might shock some people. Let me try and get it here. So he will go on to note, and by the way, this is the heretic. This is the Arian. This is Arius of Pontus. Not the same Arius, the other Arius, but he says, okay, let me read it all and I'll put the text up. Why do you mention the names of the dead after their deaths, i.e. in the liturgy? If the living prays or is given alms, how will this benefit the dead? If the prayer of the people here has benefited the people there, no one should practice piety or perform good works. So we read that already. But he goes onward to say, he should get some friends any way he wants, either by bribery or by asking friends on his deathbed. They should pray that he may not suffer in the next life or to be held accountable for his sins. And then he says this. This is pretty significant here. He says, and there can be no set time for fasting. He says, these are Jewish customs. That is significant there. Over and over. And by the way, I wrote to a scholar who has translated the works of Epiphanius to make sure that this is the very best reading. I went to the Patrologia to look at it. Very clear. Now, St. Epiphanius responds very clearly. This has been passed down from on old. But one of the attacks on the other side from Arius is that he doesn't believe that this should be done. And clearly what comes to the table is that these are Jewish customs. Well, there you go. If they are Jewish customs, very clearly they have been believed even before the New Testament began to be authored, even before the time of Christ. You've got this believed. This was taught in ancient Judaism, and it's been taught since then. What are your thoughts, brothers? David, I'll go with you first, David.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, I think whether you look at Jewish or Christian sources, you either have to argue that, these Jews didn't know what they were talking about. And then you have a huge gap where nobody believed in praying for the dead. And suddenly you have Epiphanius, who, by the way, claims that it comes from the fathers even before and before and before. I see just a, connected chain of tradition that goes even beyond Christendom. Yeah,
and I really think those words really echo powerfully. Who has better knowledge of these things?
Right.
The man who barely arrived, or the tradition of the church. Gary, what are your thoughts, brother?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Yeah, I mean, you could really sketch out continuity there, which of course lowers the likelihood that Second Maccabees is kind of an odd duckling, right? I mean, it definitely goes back to the first century, certainly before then. And so Second Maccabees fits really nice within that continuity.
Sure does. Yeah, no, without a doubt, it does. And I think that, man, that was fun going over those texts and looking at it. And I think ultimately, I'll give my final wrap-up thoughts. I think ultimately, what you clearly have here is you've got a book that was utilized in ancient Judaism and a book that you have in the Septuagint clearly teaches purgatory. A book that the early church fathers knew taught purgatory. And a book that the proto-reformers, if you will, and the reformers clearly knew taught purgatory, which is why they rejected it. Clearly, that's why Luther. Look, we did a show on the disavowal of Purgatorio, going over the whole of that relevant text. And Luther is clear. He knows Second Maccabees teaches purgatory. And he'll even say that's all they've got, which of course it is not. But he'll make that powerful note. Why is that a powerful point? Because all the while, even though they are trashing the book as not canonical, they're making the point for us that it does teach the doctrine of purgatory, and it has been present there from the beginning. So ultimately, this argument from our Calvinist friends simply does not hold up. And those are my particular concluding thoughts. What are your thoughts, Gary?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much more to add. You pretty much summed it up. Yeah, I wasn't very impressed with it. And like I said, it seems based on speculation and not an authentic reading of the text. And just like you laid out, I mean, there's no evidence for it being a later spurious addition to the text.
Yeah.
And if it's within the continuity of belief for Jews and Christians. So I mean, that's pretty much it right there.
Yeah. David, any particular wrap-up thoughts on it?
Yeah, maybe just very briefly addressing a few things they said besides these. So one of them was that, as I said, the false dichotomy, that it probably it's the narrators or epitomiters thought and not original to Judas Maccabees. There's no evidence for that. It's, again, for me, pure speculation. The question is what the text of Second Maccabees says. The second thing is, they argued also that Judas Maccabees was a proto-Sadducee, right? So he could not have believed in the resurrection. So therefore, it's quite clear that this later that the part where there is the prayer for the dead because of the resurrection, that it must be a later interpolation. But actually, history proves otherwise. And I don't know if you have the text at hand from Josephus.
Yeah.
Who is the earliest historian, is Jewish, right? So and he clearly says that John Hyrcanus, who was part of the Hasmonean dynasty or the Maccabean dynasty, I think Judas Maccabeus was his great-grandfather. So Judas Maccabeus died in 160 BC, roughly, and Hyrcanus was born in that same year. So actually, again, you almost have perfect continuity. If you want to say that John Hyrcanus was innovating, I mean, that's very, very a stretch, right? Because Josephus says in Antiquities 13.10.5 that Hyrcanus was a disciple of the Pharisees. He could not be the disciple of the Sadducees. So no, they were not Sadducees. They were not proto-Sadducees. They clearly believed in the resurrection. And the same thing you find in Talmud Kiddushin 66a, which again a rabbinic tradition that testifies the same thing, that the Maccabean martyrs or John Hyrcanus was a Pharisee, right? And then there were other things they brought up, just very briefly. For example, that it's the intention of Judas Maccabeus and not the act that is talked about in Second Maccabees, that perhaps he had a good intention, to offer prayers and an sin offering for these dead, but actually it was false, which for me is very interesting because those people died, right, because of these amulets from Jamnia. I agree. I completely agree because they had these amulets. And Judas Maccabeus points to them, look, don't do this because you're going to die as well. And now suddenly Judas Maccabeus would do another erroneous thing and offer prayers and sin offerings for these dead. So actually, even he would double down. I mean, and one of the in the Q&A section in that video, person named Jeffrey brought up a very good thing. Look, this drachmas were sent to the temple to do this sin offering.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody agreed that we have to do this for this dead, in the temple, And so the argument was, Judas Maccabeus was probably the high priest. And so all the Levites had to follow him no matter what. I mean, no, that's not true. I mean, if the Levites would not agree, everybody would knew that this is a wrong thing to do. I don't think they would just, present this sin offering. And the third thing I would like to say, I don't think it's idolatry in what is described in 2nd Maccabees.
Right.
The only thing we know that they had these amulets. We don't know for what purpose. It could have been just the purpose that they wanted. It was made from gold or something valuable. They wanted to carry it away, probably sell it. But they were still fighting on gods, for the Israelites. They were not fighting for a different god. They just had these amulets.
Yep.
Did they do the wrong thing? Yes. Did they commit idolatry? I don't think it can be proven. Nowhere the text says that they worshiped these idols from Janvier. They just simply had them on it. They were wearing it. They had it with them. The same thing like Achan brought these things from Jericho, which was wrong, but it doesn't mean he committed idolatry, right? So that's a great nuance. So we should not just assume that they committed idolatry. So that's it. I mean, there are plenty of other things, the godliness thing, they try to misrepresent it or something, explain it away that, because we know these people died in godliness. So, I don't think those arguments from their side were compelling. I mean, the text says they died in godliness. So, I mean, that's where plainly said there. So, yeah.
I completely agree. I think those are great points. Look, they were fighting for the one true God. We knew that they were fighting for the one true God. They definitely should not have been having those amulets. They should not have had them. But without a doubt, to then make the jump that they were idolaters and they worship false gods, that's a jump that simply, unfortunately, you cannot make from the text. You simply can't.
And one more thing, they said, but they were punished. They were put to death. So it was a mortal sin. I mean, look, when Moses didn't believe that the water will spring from the rock, he was said he's not going to make it into the promised land.
Yep.
So in a certain way, he was put to death before reaching the promised land. It's just a matter of time when you die. So these ones died immediately. Moses died a little bit later, but still was punished.
Yep.
Right?
100%.
I don't see a difference.
I think those are fantastic points, David. Great points. And as we come to wrapping up, I'd love to give you brothers a little bit of time. Put in a plug for anything you may be working on, or what do you got coming down the pipeline? Let me go with you first, there, Brother Gary. What do you got? What do you got cooking for us, brother?
No, doing a lot of writing. Trying to start getting back to doing videos since that manuscript was already turned in, and now I have another manuscript I'm working on. I might do a talk, God willing, on Sam Shamoon's channel.
Yeah,
it's going to be the talk I gave in Steubenville on 7 things non-believers miss about the Gospels. And,
wow.
It was a really good, got a lot of good feedback for that, and I think it'd be great to share with Catholics and non-Catholics and how we could do a better job defending the Gospels.
100%. That's awesome. I can't wait for that. That'll be incredible. Brother David, what have you been working on, brother? What do you got in the pipeline for us?
Yeah, so projects. One of them is on Erasmus. So that's going to be very interesting.
Very.
I got also on Jubilees, one working on whether there is a mention of the 22 books.
Yeah.
And and all sorts of things, but working very slowly. Got other things to do, family, work, PhD studies, all these stuff. Yeah.
Incredible. Awesome, brother. Well,
how about you, William?
Yeah. Well, this comes at a very timely moment in history because I'm doing a lot of purgatory work. So this is fun that we were able to dive into this, and just been working on a lot of stuff, working on multiple books. I got one that I'm working on with Catholic Answers. I got a few others that I'm wrapping up, and multiple debates. I've begun filming and editing shows, more shows in Spanish for the Apocryphal Apocalypse, and debating as well in Spanish. So I've been very, very busy, but a very good, fun kind of busy, but never too busy to be able to put some time to the side to be able to do incredible shows with you brothers. I had a great time today, a fantastic time. And I tell you one thing, I know the audience are going to love it. They love it whenever we gather around the virtual table. And God willing, soon we'll all three of us gather around that table because Sam really wants to have us on. Soon we'll be on with Sam, God willing. We'll be able to, all three of us, go over there and present something. But other than that, everything going great. And I look forward to everything that we've got, God willing, to be able to present for everybody here at the Apocryphal Apocalypse very, very, very soon. Thrilled for that. Awesome. With that being said, everybody, do us a huge favor. For the algorithm, flood the comment section down below. I don't care what you want to say. Hey, you got a shiny bald head, William. Hey, I don't care what. Just flood it. Did you enjoy the show? Did you love it? Were you edified? What do you want us to produce? Are you excited about the brother David's future material? The brother Gary's? What are you thrilled for? What do you want us to cover? Let us know down below. Let us know in the chat if you're watching it right now, as it is premiering. Tell us what you want to see. We're thrilled to hear your feedback. And don't forget to hit like, share, and subscribe if you have not yet. Everybody, thank you for tuning in. God bless all of you all. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.